Dan, I really appreciate you making time to be here on the podcast today.
Lovely to be here. Looking forward to this one, Mike.
You've had some really cool roles in electronic arts and quite a storied career there as well. And the new thing that you're putting your passion into is electronic arts, EA Ventures. And I'm super curious to just start there. Tell us about why. Like, it's a year old now. What was it? Why come up with this concept? Why launch this within EA? What have you discovered it actually is a year into it? Yeah, tell us a story.
Absolutely. It's a great jumping off point, but also we're 12 years now into my time at EA, which has been some of the most rewarding time of my career and full of so many different things and so many different firsts, which I'm sure we'll get into. But Ventures, to your point, Mike, is something that we stood up almost a year ago. It's really thinking about how do we explore a number of opportunities our company has to grow into the future. We have a very meaningful footprint in the world of video games, which we love. We also believe that that is a huge area of additional opportunity that we can build upon. So we think our community is actually our most valuable asset as a company. We make amazing games. We've made those games for decades and decades, but it's the communities that spend time in those games and around those games, and even a little bit beyond those games, that we believe presents an enormous opportunity for us to grow as a company. So Ventures is really about harnessing the power of that community, which is how we talk about it internally. And in order to do that, we're going to deliver a number of experiences over a number of years that are not video games. Now, they'll be connected to our games in many different ways, as you would expect, but they won't actually be video games. They'll be about how we extend that engagement that our fans and our community has when they're not actually playing our games. So that's where we think a tremendous amount of opportunity is kind of sitting there ready for us to take. But it really requires us to think about a lot of things in a very different way, because these are different experiences for us. Like, they're not going to be video games, and we know a lot about video games, but we don't necessarily know a lot about some of these other formats of entertainment. We'll also be delivering them in different ways, so we won't build them in the way that we build video games. We might partner with new organizations, we might partner with other teams, we might buy some teams to kind of help us progress through that scale quickly. So this will be a process of us learning to do new things in different way to fuel the next level of growth for our company. So again, we're almost a year into it. We're learning a lot every day. In some ways, it's a lot harder than we thought, but in other ways, it's incredibly rewarding. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what we will deliver as part of this new area of EA.
What I love about what you've just said is this kind of pivot. Like, if I was to think about electronic arts, like back in the day when I used to play a lot more video games, I think, it's like they're video games on a console, and then they were connected to the web. And then all of a sudden, I can play with my buddies. And now that's grown into these large scale multiplayer games where people from around the world are connecting. And all of a sudden, now I'm hearing you and I'm like, electronic arts is in the community business.
Yes.
That's right. Like, you're in the community business. And when you think we're a video game company, your innovation stems from that starting point. And what I see you've pivoted with Ventures is to say, no, we're actually in the community business. And from the place of community, the innovation that we want to go after is so much broader and wider than it would be if we stuck to the framing of, we're a video game company, we're going to go, make our own video game. Maybe we'll buy some studios, we'll launch some new titles. Those are two very different places to make a starting jumping off point, both in innovation and creativity.
100%. I think you've nailed it immediately, which is hilarious to see. I think we're very much in the community business. We have an enormous footprint of gamers. I think if you look at across EA, we have over 700 million gamer accounts. So these are people who actively play our games. It's an unbelievable community in terms of how big and how powerful it is. But even when we start to think more specifically along certain subject matters, so we'll take sports as an example, we have over 370 million people who have played one of our sports games in the last year alone, played or consumed some of the content within one of our sports games.
That's the entire population of the United States.
Exactly. It makes us one of the biggest single communities of sports fans globally. And that's just through the lens of video games. So if you think about a footprint, it's enormous. But then you think about what we think a lot about is some of the macro trends for how those communities are consuming entertainment. And we feel like video games are really at the tip of that trend towards experiences that are more social, more interactive, and more immersive. And whether they're video games or not, those are the motivations that communities have. And if you double click on the younger demographic within that community, it just amplifies, again, the need to be able to do things with your friends, the need to have agency in them being interactive and to spend time inside of them just amplifies even more as you go down to a younger demographic. So yeah, we are very much in the community business, and we think all communities want to consume entertainment in a way that starts to look more and more like a video game.
I'm just doing the math in my head. And if I think about 700 million people, that would make the community of electronic arts game players the third largest country in the world.
It's quite staggering, isn't it?
It's mind blowing. And to say that 370 million of them have played your sporting game, or played a sport game of some description, that I would say, like, that also still makes you the third largest country in the world. Last time I checked the US population stats. So like that's staggering to understand that you've created this community that's at that scope and scale from what was supposed to be a company that sold video games to people. And a lot of people played them, but weren't connected in a community environment. Like the power of having the third largest country in the world, it's mind blowing.
It's just a scale that is very hard to get your head around. And then when we think about the opportunities ahead of us in terms of how we engage that community beyond the video games, like the opportunity is quite profound, which is really why it's such an important piece of our company strategy. We effectively have three areas that we focus on, and this is the third. So it has the highest altitude of importance. We had an investor day semi-recently in September where we spoke a lot about this as an area of focus for our company, because to your point, what we already have in terms of a footprint is enormous, but the opportunity goes well beyond that, because it's not just a big community of fans. Our video gamers and gamers in general are some of the most engaged consumers. They have the highest affinity for the subject matter that they're engaging in, and they're some of the most social consumers of entertainment. So it's not just a big community, but it's a highly engaged community. And from there, we think that gives us the permission to think about new ways that we can innovate, whether we're innovating in the experience that we're putting in front of them, whether we're innovating in the value proposition in terms of how we provide value for fans, or whether we're just innovating in terms of the type of experiences and how we deliver those experiences for those fans.
What I find fascinating is that, the community that you have created, as you describe it, they're not just consuming the product, as you say, like they're not going to the experience, right? If you're going to a Taylor Swift concert, right? You're sitting there. I mean, maybe you're dancing around, but really like Taylor Swift and her crew are doing the thing. And you're not really actively participating in creating that experience. You're witnessing it. Whereas, in the case of the communities you have, the game players themselves, the community members, are actively actually creating the experience that they're both part of, but they're actively creating that experience for other people through the connections they're making on your platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I joined EA, we spoke a lot about EA being a lean-in company versus a lean-back. Like traditional entertainment, like broadcast, is very much a lean-back and just consume, to your point, and video games became this more interactive lean-in experience. And I think that has just got bigger and bigger and more kind of profound over the past decade plus. And I think to your point, not only is the community lean in, but the community creates the experiences in many cases. It creates the content that fuels the experiences. It creates the connections between itself to kind of fuel ongoing experiences inside of these games. So the community really is the lifeblood of many of our games going forward. But it's not even just about the game experience for us from a user-generated experience, user-generated content perspective. It's also how fans discover our games. So again, when I joined EA 10, 12 years ago, the way we would market our video games would be very big trailers would be produced, we'd have very big marketing campaigns, and it would be all about the launch of the game and that very important day. Now, the day we launch a game is still important, but every day after that for the rest of the year is almost equally important, where we're continually producing material and content and experiences that go out to the community to bring them into the game. And we also know that our new fans who are consuming and enjoying our games are discovering them through their friends before they discover them through us. They're discovering them through their
Oh,
friends before traditional marketing channels or even their
right.
family members. And I think a stat that I read actually a couple of days ago was 86% of the next generation of fans will discover a new game or a new entertainment experience through one of their friends before they will do it through traditional entertainment channels or traditional marketing channels. So the importance of a community, not just in terms of enjoying the game, but even just the discovery of the game in the first place is far more important than it used to be.
So your entire like business development funnel, your sales, your marketing, your PR, your advertising is literally the community itself. 87% of the time, the community itself is actually the most powerful tool that you have in your marketing arsenal today.
Yeah, we have over 15,000 creators who create content in and around our games on an almost daily basis and build their own audiences that they engage with that content. And that content ultimately puts our games front and center, whether it's teaching them how to play the games, whether it's just sharing a really cool moment, whether it's showing ways that they've customized the game and created their own content, whatever it might be. Over 15,000 creators are doing that on an almost daily basis, which starts to shift how we think about putting our games in front of consumers and how we think that they'll discover the game in the first place.
Right, because I guess at that point you're saying we're the original author of the game, and yet you're almost creating a platform where you have created a platform where other creators can then show their creativity by creating on top of the platform that you've created for the game, and then they're going to get their own fan base because if they do a great job and people love what they do, when they go release another mod, then people are going to want to follow that. Like the ecosystem is kind of helping to feed itself. And in this economy of influencers, you've got influencers on all social platforms. Now you've got influencers in the gaming space.
Yes. I think the power of those influences, we talk a lot about the creator economy, which is really about how do we create a creator economy, a creator network, and then feed that creator network with valuable and interesting content that they would want to build an audience around. So that's incredibly important. But to your point as well, we find that when fans consume content that's generated by one of our creators, they are highly likely to start producing their own content that goes into the game or goes out to their own social
Oh,
network as well. In fact,
really?
80% of our fans who consume a game experience generated by a fellow consumer or a fellow fan will start to produce their own content, their own experiences as well. So it's almost this kind of constantly reiterating, amplifying kind of loop of the community creates the content inside of the game ecosystem. The community enjoys, consumes, and shares that content, and then they start to create even more content. And you can see, if you think about that as a way to both bring consumers in, but to continue engaging them, the scale that you can get to is far more profound than traditional, one to many, which is how we used to do it.
So that also creates a very fascinating innovation challenge, which is now in the past, you would behind closed doors in secret, you'd be building out a game. You might like let the public know it was coming, but nobody gets to see it yet. It's in, alpha mode, it's in beta mode. You're doing all your internal testing. And then the big day comes out, you announce the game. It's a static game in the past. It was a game. It stayed the way it was. Well, now you have not only 15,000 creators, but you've got a feedback loop of the things that those creators wanted, the tools they want to use, any change you make. I'm sure you're going to get good and bad feedback. So how do you manage the sheer, like a community that size, not the 700 million, even just the 15,000 creators? How do you manage the feedback loop? Of all of the information that must flow in on a daily basis, what probably are very minute changes, but could mess with somebody's world if they're a creator, and they could have a
Yeah.
very strong opinion about that. So how do you balance your own innovation and your own drive to have a roadmap for your products and your games with the feedback that you're getting from these highly engaged? Like I'm assuming these 15,000 are the most engaged,
Yeah.
of the 370 million or 700 million. How do you manage that?
I think at a macro level, it's about two things. In one way, we've shifted a lot of our investment in terms of how we think about building games and marketing games towards this concept, towards the concept of the creator economy. And in order to be able to feed the creator economy, we needed our own community teams that would be the intersection point with that network. So we built over years really large community teams internally who would manage those communities. So that was a real shift in investment, in headcount, and just like focus and priority for us. So we now have very large community teams inside of almost each of our franchises. So that's a shift of how we invest, if you like. Also, how we build games has changed. So to your point, we used to build a game behind a closed door for a year or so and then release it. And then everybody in the development team would take a holiday for a little while because it was so hard to get that game done. That is completely changed now. The run into getting a game launched is far more effectively managed. So we don't have those difficult run into launches, which were always challenging. But more important for us, day one is literally just day one. We will ship updates to a game, in some cases, over 300 days of the year. In the case of FC, I think it's well over 300, which is our biggest single sports game and our football title that used to be referred to as FIFA. That game, as I say, will get updates over 300 days of every year. So that is a constant contact with our community. It's a constant provision of content. Those updates are themselves informed by what's happening in the real world. So there's another level of dynamicism to that content, which I think just makes this constant connection with our community. And then also how we're building even some of our newer games is different in itself. So a game, for example, Skate, which we're building a new version of Skate, which is a beloved favorite of our company many, many years ago. And that game has been in development for multiple years and has an active community base in the development product at the moment. So we essentially have an open beta that we're going to run for multiple years as we progressively build the game. And the feedback that we get from that community on a daily basis helps inform how the team think about building the game tomorrow and over a longer period of time. So that game, when it releases, will truly be a reflection of what the community wanted from us as it relates to our next Skate game. So how we build games is different, and how we service those games from community and our community teams is very different nowadays.
So this has completely flipped the script on how Electronic Arts thinks of itself as an organization, the strategy long term, moving from a game producer into a builder of global communities, let alone one that's the third largest country in the world. Operating from that place, innovation takes on a different lens. And I'm curious, as you've gone through your career, you've always been in the innovation space. I mean, it's kind of wired into your DNA. As you think about how we need to think about leaders today, think about innovation, how has it shifted? Like, what have you seen in the last kind of like 3 to 5 years that has changed your viewpoint and would help inform listeners who are in a leadership role right now, who are like, I want to be that innovative. I want to be as innovative as the way that Electronic Arts is rethinking its brand and its way of bringing value to the marketplace. Like, what's changed?
That's a great question, because I actually think some things haven't changed. So the need for innovation to be just a key part of the core strategy for the organization hasn't changed and can't change. That without that, you'll never have the impact or the outcome from any investment or energy put into innovation. So that for me hasn't changed. What has changed, and this is possibly exaggerated for us through the lens of entertainment, but what has changed is having the consumer be the first lens on innovation. So any idea that we have, any concept that we're interested in, any prototype that we're working on, the first thing that we will try to do, and we'll try to do it as early as possible, is understand how a consumer thinks and feels about what we're doing. How do we validate whether we're on the right track through consumer, or how do we validate that we in fact are not? And we try to do that far earlier in the process than we previously would have. And we would normally really spend a lot of time iterating on a concept and building very robust, high technology, high quality prototypes to then put it out quite late in the cycle. And I think that's a slower way of doing it. It's a more expensive way to do it, and it's more risky in terms of whether that modality of entertainment is going to work or not. So I think that's the thing that's changed for us. And as we expand out of our core competency of games into some other types of entertainment, that's going to become even more important. And what we're trying to do now with a brand new incubation team that we're standing up literally at the moment is how do we bring in consumer validation even earlier in that process? And I think that's the big piece that's changed. I think what's also important is it requires more leadership. So we've always spoken about team culture to foster innovation and to help drive innovation. That's absolutely important. We need a culture of experimentation, of shared learnings, a culture where it's not even just okay to fail, it's actually celebrated. That's been important in innovation for quite some time and will continue to be. But the role of leadership is even more important because the space that we're operating in is just even more competitive for consumer attention, competitive for where we invest our resources, and competitive just in almost every way. So the role of leadership in innovation is even more critical for it to be successful. And how we think about that is the leader needs to do all the work to create that team culture that we just kind of spoke briefly about, but also needs to be the champion for the work, the champion for innovation, has to have the vision that can be articulated and communicated and bring a workforce along with you. But they also need to be able to prioritize really practical things like resources and investment and keep that protected and keep that environment where it's okay to continue to iterate on these concepts until they are validated either positively or negatively by consumers. So the role of a leader versus innovation being purely grassroots or bottoms up, I think has been a bit of a change for us.
And so with that experience in mind, and like, there's probably listeners who are hearing this right now and saying, well, I want to be that leader. Where do you start? Like, if you think to yourself, like, listeners sitting there saying like, I want to be more innovative and I don't really know where to start. Like, I hear everything Dan's saying and I agree with him. Where's the best starting point from your perspective?
I think the best place to start is less of an actual area of focus and more kind of like a mindset. So for us, when we think about innovation, we think about it through kind of two really important principles. One is a growth mindset. So do you have a growth mindset? Because that is critical in terms of like building and delivering new innovation. And then do you have empathy, or do you have an ability to create human connection? So for us, a growth mindset is really informed by thinking about how to generate and encourage curiosity. Like we have a lot of passion for the concept of curiosity. We think curiosity is incredibly important for fostering innovation. It's incredibly important for driving collaboration across an organization, particularly a large organization. And it's also really important for building adaptability into a leader and adaptability into a team, which is becoming even more important. So that's probably maybe something we should talk about as well, the need to be comfortable with ambiguity and they're comfortable to be an adaptable leader. But so curiosity is really what we think informs a growth mindset and what fosters and generates innovation. And then human connection or empathy is what builds the right team culture that we spoke about for us, like how we create trust and how do we generate really real relationships inside of our teams and a psychological safety in terms of being open with how you're feeling about something and how you're performing and celebrating things that don't go well as things that do go well. So again, for us, curiosity and empathy is what kind of drives a lot of the way that we think about innovation.
Well, it's interesting because you're touching on emotional intelligence when you talk about empathy and curiosity. Like, those are mated together, right? To have deep empathy, I have to be curious. I have to have the empathy to be able to ask great questions, to understand your perspective. Maybe not agree with it, because that's not the first part. The first part is just like, do I deeply understand your perspective? Even if I disagree with it, do I understand you? And that is a learned skill for leaders, to step back from the place of like, I can make a great statement because I'm a smart person and I don't know a lot about this topic. Or I could step back and say, no, what's the best question I could ask so I can understand what this other person is saying? The other thing you sort of touched in there, which I loved, is this adaptability. And so we just talked about emotional intelligence, that's EQ, and we know that's malleable, right? Like, we can grow our emotional intelligence throughout our lives. Like, we can learn how to become more empathetic. We can learn how to become more self-aware. We can do things to increase our motivation. We can improve our social skills, and we can work on our ability to self-regulate as is appropriate for the situation. So it's malleable, things we can change. our intelligence is kind of like fixed, right? Like maybe we'll
Yeah.
get a little bit smarter, but the most recent research I read is maybe like 11 points is about the best you could do. And really, I think that's actually intelligence mated with experience. And what you're actually is you're wiser is the reality
Yes.
of it.
Yeah.
The third quotient that's come out is adaptability quotient. And so so if there's IQ and there's EQ, there's now AQ. And AQ
Mm.
is my ability to adapt to a changing reality and changing circumstances, to hold a more loosely held beliefs that will allow me to adapt my thought process and my mindset to how the world is changing around me. And that will also help to support resilience. So people that are good at that, we would say that they have a high AQ. Their adaptability quotient is improving. And as you hear those things, growth mindset fits right smack dab in the middle of your adaptability quotient. So that's actually one of the principles of being adaptable. And so that is also malleable. So that's the wonderful thing. If our IQ is fixed, our EQ and our AQ are malleable. So we can grow to have a more adaptable mindset. And as you say, the entrance point to that, kind of like the ticket at the front gate, is you have to ground yourself in a growth mindset to be able to go that direction.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. I hadn't heard the AQ concept. I'm gonna read more about that and use that. And I'm not sure if I'm even growing in intelligence by 11 points, Mike. So I maybe need to kind of pick up my game a little bit. But I do believe you're spot on around the importance of adaptability. I think it continues to become even more important. I think it's even more important because if we think about our need to be empathetic, and being empathetic means that we're open to different perspectives, open to different people's opinions, and then we tailor how we work with those people and the cultures and how we do that to those people. You can't really actually even do that if you're not being adaptable, right? So there's no point like listening to a perspective of someone if you actually don't change what you're doing as a result of that.
Right.
So adaptability is just so important purely for team culture and that empathy. But also, I think the rate of change happens, not to be too cliche, but the rate of change, at least that we see, has never been faster. So every year, some things happen, whether it's technology, whether it's user experiences, whether it's consumer motivations, whether it's macro trends, everything constantly changes. And we can't get to the level of fidelity around our planning that we used to try to. So now we really don't let perfection be the enemy of good, and we try to move forward with plans that we know are not complete. And we ask people to be comfortable with that ambiguity. And that's actually even more important and even more prevalent for us, but still something that I think people need to get used to, that ambiguity in planning and ambiguity of what it means for an individual leader's role inside of that. And then I also think, specifically as it relates to innovation, the process to run innovation inherently is iterative. And like I said earlier, it's also informed by what the consumer thinks about what we're trying to achieve. So a process that's iterative, which has the smallest circles possible in terms of a loop of completion, informed by external sources such as the consumer, will inevitably change on a constant basis. So if you can't adapt to how we're trying to achieve a goal, or even what the goal itself is, I think it's going to be really challenging to build and generate innovation inside of an organization in today's market and today's kind of competitive landscape.
Sahil Bloom had a wonderful blog post out in the last couple of weeks and spoke about the reality of this ever increasing pace of change that you describe. And his comment was, planning is really challenging now, because planning really has always been, we can foretell what we think the world will look like in 3 to 5 years. And we can't anymore.
No.
And so planning becomes really difficult. And what he said is, he thinks the trend needs to go from planning to preparing.
Yes.
And preparing is taking all the relative information and relevant information that I have and using that to prepare and then get started. And the act of getting started is that act of being in an iterative process where I will get as much information as I can and I will get started. In fact, it's interesting because the US Army actually did the Marine expedition, not the Marines, not the Army. The Marines did a study on this to figure out, of the Marine expeditionary units, who were the most effective at decision making. The ones that wanted the decision to be perfect
Mm-hmm.
were the slowest to act and the least adaptable to the changing environment.
Yes.
The ones that got to the 70% mark, which is interesting because I would have thought it was 80%, but they said the ones that got to the 70% mark and said, we have about 7/10 of the information that we need to take action. And then that's all the preparation that they did. And then they took action and then responded as they got more information. Those groups actually made better decisions, had better outcomes, and were able to move faster than the ones who spent more time planning before executing. And I
Yeah.
feel that's the perfect kind of analogy for what we're talking about today, which is to get us into this iterative cycle. We can't be stuck in analysis paralysis
Yeah.
where we're expecting we're going to get all of the information, because having all the information, we would have to say, hey, can somebody stop the world from spinning for a while? I don't want anything to change because I've got this like fact set. And if the fact set changes, then it's going to wreck my plan. Whereas
Yeah.
preparation on the other side says, I'm going to get as much information as I can, and then I'm going to start taking action in an iterative way, right, towards a defined outcome. And I am going to adapt to that changing environment as we go.
I think I think that's completely right, and I think we also just need to understand, even with as much time as humanly possible, we actually can't know everything anyway. And I think sometimes historically we've rested on like these false concepts of like very large, robust, deeply thought through plans that give us this comfort. Like, look at the fidelity of the planning here. We must know exactly what's going to happen. And it often doesn't happen that way anyway. And I think we just need to realize that we don't necessarily know everything. So the sooner we start to learn, the better. However, and I actually think it's easy to say this and really hard to do it, and really hard to make these kind of changes, and even harder in big organizations. And I think the last year for me has underscored that. And I knew coming into this, in fact, the reason I came into setting up ventures was I knew it was going to be hard. Trying to set up a new ventures entity, an innovation driven entity inside of a large corporate organization is inevitably one of the harder things to try to do. And I knew that. And it's even harder than I thought it would be. And I think that the challenges in like moving from planning to preparation is most organizations, at least in my experience, have set up systems and processes and ways of working that serve that organization well, that build for predictability, that build for growth, build for profitability in the way that the organization requires. And we are a great example of that. We build video games in a very, very effective way, and we can forecast the commercial impact for us in a pretty accurate way for those video games, for the most part. But what we can't do when we're trying to do new things that are different types of experiences built and delivered in different ways is approach it in that kind of way where we expect a huge fidelity of detail and data to support a plan. In fact, what we need to do is exactly what you just said, and work faster and get to the first point quicker and have smaller loops of iteration that inform the plan by how it performs, how it actually goes with consumers. And I think that's the shift. And I also think, back to adaptability and ambiguity, the way we organize teams also needs to change a bit as well. Like the traditional, very hierarchical format actually doesn't lend itself always as effectively to innovation or even just new ventures in typical. And what we've tried to do is create a far more flat structure that is based on partnership and peer versus reporting and that kind of dynamic. And I think that has been effective, but also been hard for actually some people to kind of get their heads around in terms of understanding, okay, I get that we're flat, but like, who do I report to, or what's the structure look like? And I think that's just a mindset shift that is required in some of these new areas.
The systems and the procedures of this giant organization that you describe, they also create an organizational immune function. And when new or different shows up, the immune function is triggered.
Yes.
Even if everyone thinks it's a good idea, still that immune function is triggered. One of my close buddies used to live in New York, and she's in London now. And she was hired to be the head of digitization, artificial intelligence, and machine learning for one of the major banks in New York.
Mhm.
And when she arrived, they said, "Oh, you can be on the fourth floor. We've got some space there for you and your team." And she said, "Okay, I need monitors for all the walls. I need projectors. I need stand-up desks. And we're all going to operate on Macs because they're all like they should designers and system thinkers and like machine learning experts. And, they're not going to run on a Windows PC." And so facilities came back and said, "So we have cherry wood and we have mahogany. We have matching credenzas. Um, we have Windows laptops, or you can have a desktop. And we do not have standing desks. And you can have a flip chart or a whiteboard for your walls." And their job was to come in and innovate this super old bank and bring it into the future, bring in AI, bring in machine learning, bring in the digitization of where banking is going. And yet literally just trying to get the thing set up physically, the organizational immune function had already kicked in. And so I said to her, "You need to find a building that's owned by the bank and empty." And I guarantee you somewhere in Manhattan there's a building like that. And you
Yeah.
need to set up shop there, and you need to get your boss to give you a blank check for all the things you need to go buy. And you can't buy them through the procurement process of the bank. You need to get your own budget and go buy. And so she did. She went and got everything she needed exactly how she wanted it set up, or she'd never hire any of the people because they would never work in the environment that would have been structured by the organizational immune function. And I said, and then you need to act like a consulting firm. You can't act like a division or a portion of the bank. You have to go in, consult, and then come back out. Or they can come to your offices, you can do the consultation with them, and then they need to leave. But you can't be part of it because this organizational immune function will devour you because different is bad.
Yes.
Different is, we don't know different here. It looks cool, but if we don't know what to do with it, so we're going to do everything in our power to shut it down, even though we asked for it.
Yeah, like the silent detractors are the most difficult, or most detrimental to any form of kind of new venture, new innovation, and most don't even know that they are being a silent detractor when they are. And I think a great example of that also is Nike with the innovation kitchen that they set up many years ago, which actually was where some of their greatest innovations like Flynet and other formats kind of originated from. We don't quite have the challenge of mahogany and credenzas necessarily. We're a little bit more modern than that. However,
Yeah.
the same concept is we live it every day. Again, we build a lot of video games for a lot of consumers. Our sports video games come out each and every year, which is actually somewhat unique for the gaming industry. Most games will be built over multiple years, but our sports business builds annualized games, and they can only do that with incredible operational rigor, process, and talent. And that rigor, process, and talent delivers a predictability that is critical for the business. Like we cannot miss dates within our sports
Right.
business. So the business values predictability and uses operational strength in order to deliver that predictability. That's great. We're not looking for predictability at all. In fact, we're looking to be unpredictable. We're looking for product market fit, and we don't know what that looks like and when we'll get it, but we understand the process that we think is going to be most effective to get to product market fit. Product market fit process and a schedule or a process to deliver predictability are very, very different things.
Right.
So when the business that values predictability looks at a process or a schedule to get to product market fit, it doesn't like it, either intentionally or unintentionally. Doesn't, to your point, can't relate to it because it's different. And there lies the challenge in terms of when things look and feel different for an organization that has built a system over many years to great success, to be very clear, it's really difficult when that is different.
So you're an amazing facilitator, and you've facilitated strategic sessions all over EA Sports throughout the years. Yeah, when you used to head up strategy, so you're used to being in an environment with competing ideologies. So what is it like now? Like, how do you work with your team and with the business units when you really all want the same thing, but ideologically, the way that you approach getting that same outcome is different. So how do you manage those conversations? Like, what place do you need to put yourself as a leader from an intentionality perspective to show up in a way that is going to foster the best possible outcome for teams that may ideological think about how to create that success in a very different way?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The honest, complete answer for you, Mike, is I don't think we have all the answers to that, because I actually think it's like an ongoing daily struggle or pursuit in order to run a highly effective innovation and ventures group inside of a big organization. However, where we focus is we've thought a lot about curiosity and empathy being part of that. So from an empathy perspective, we try to ask a lot of questions of the rest of the business, of our important stakeholders, in terms of what they would expect to see, what they would like to see, what their goals, what the strategy for their business unit is over the next year, 2, 3 years, and understand their perspective as to the lens that they have when they come in and look at the work we're doing. And if we can use empathy through active listening and just generally curious questions, I think we get a better understanding of how they're thinking about it and the biases and the perspective that they bring to those conversations. And I think curiosity in itself is also how we approach it. So we encourage questions. We call it the why factor. In fact, we will just continually ask why all the time until we get to the end point of the statement that someone is trying to make. So if someone within the team or external to the team delivers information, insight, facts in some capacity, the first question anybody in our team will ask is why. Why is that the case? Or why do you think that is? Or why did that happen? And then we'll get an answer, and then we'll say, okay, well, why do you think that was the driving factor for that change to happen, or that influence to bring in? And I think that encouraging an environment where we can ask ourselves the questions, but we also have the curiosity to ask our stakeholders and colleagues and peers the questions, is how we start to engage in a slightly different way. I think a little bit more tactically or productively or even practically, we're really trying to identify the areas of the organization that we have to intersect with and the areas that we do not have to intersect with. So we're actually not trying to run ventures through the existing established rhythm of the business. We're actually trying to create an augmented or adapted rhythm of the business, where we plug in to executives, we plug into stakeholders, we plug into systems in the appropriate way, but only in the way that works for what we're trying to do. So inevitably, we have a smaller footprint in terms of who we speak to and the intersection points that we have across the organization. And we do a lot of work to contract with those stakeholders in terms of what to expect to see from us and what we expect to see from you. And we've invested a disproportionate amount of time into that process, into the selection of the people who are part of that process, and in preparing for that process. And I think that is starting to have some really positive impacts on creating and fostering a different type of engagement with the company that's been hard to do up until now.
I want to go back to the why. So Toyota actually did a bunch of research when they were coming up with their lean process. And they looked at how many whys does it actually take to get down to the root. And it's 5.
Yeah.
It's 5 levels of why. And I'm sure if you're listening to this right now, you're like, oh my God, that's going to get annoying to keep asking 5 times. Toyota did the research and they're like, the magic number is 5. If you ask the why question when you're deep into something 5 times, you will get that. Pretty much every time will get you to the root thing that you need to know. And that's a discipline that, it takes some practice, first of all, and it takes courage too, because, the first thing that popped into my mind when I read it is, man, I'm going to really annoy a lot of people if I ask them why 5 times. And I think, the reality is that the why is to generate conversation, is to generate creativity, it's to generate bigger picture thinking, and it's to truly examine an issue to the point where you're like, yeah, we've kind of got to the core of this. And I'm so glad that you brought it up, because it's been a while actually since I thought about the 5 whys, because that research that Toyota did is not new. It's probably 30 years old at this stage.
I remember reading that. I thought it was certainly profound at the time. I think the concept is so simple. It's just a very simple framework that encourages and permits curiosity, right? And people understand how to be curious when it might not be the natural tendency. And it creates this very simple but understood kind of framework for how that happens. And if you actually embed it across the entire team, people become less apprehensive towards it because it's part of the team culture. And what it also allows to happen is not just curiosity, but actually greater collaboration, because people who might have been quieter prior now have a very simple mechanic to be involved in the conversation. And they might not necessarily even have a leading perspective or thought. They might not actually understand it. And the mechanic to ask, well, why do you think that, is just an easy way to engage in the conversation, improve and increase your understanding of the topic, of the subject matter. And we find that it just creates a far more open dialogue, which inevitably creates curiosity, which then feeds, to your point at the very beginning of this, into a growth mindset. And only with a growth mindset can we do new things, can we do hard things in different ways. And that's inevitably what we're trying to do.
I'm leaving this conversation with the vision of EA Ventures being like the parents of the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works and IDEO, the design firm. Like the two of them got together and had a baby. And that is EA Ventures within the sort of scope of overall EA. It's just like unbelievably fascinating work that you've decided to devote your heartbeats to, my friend. And I'm just so grateful to have been in this conversation with you today. I've learned so much in our chat, and it's also regrounded me in the things that I know I need to be thinking about for my own business. So, Dan, thank you for making the time. It means a lot to me.
I had a lot of fun, Mike. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation and look forward to the next one.